I'm Dr. Apurva Dixit. It gives me great pleasure on behalf of the JLU School of Law to welcome you all to the International Igniting Mind lecture series. The virtual dais today is graced by the presence of Professor Dr. Penelope Andrews, Professor of Law, Co-Director Racial Justice Project, New York Law Schools, USA. On my personal behalf and on behalf of Jagran Lakecity University, I welcome you, ma'am. Before handing over the platform to the resource person, let me quickly brief you about the personality which we have amongst us. Ms. Andrews joined New York Law School in January 2019 as Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law and teaches comparative and international law courses. She also serves as co-director of IIMLS Racial Justice Project, focusing on international and Southern African issues. Professor Andrews began her teaching career at La Trobe University in Australia, where she taught for 8 years before moving to the City University of New York School of Law, where she taught public international law, gender and law, race and law, administrative law, comparative law, and taught for 15 years. She has also held visiting appointments at law schools across the US and internationally. From the year 2016 to 2018, Professor Andrews served as the first Black Dean at the University of Cape Town, Faculty of Law, and from the year 2012 to 2015, she served as the first female Dean of Albany Law School. Professor Andrews is active in international collaborative research and mentoring networks and is committed to ensuring the relevance of law and society scholarship to global academic communities. She is an editor of the International Journal of Law and Context, the Human Rights, and the Global Economy e-journal and the African Law e-journal. She has also published several books and articles that focus on comparative constitutional law, gender and racial equality, human rights, the judiciary, and the legal education. Her book, From the Cape Town to Kabul, Rethinking Strategies for Pursuing Women's Human Rights, was published in the year 2012. Professor Andrews' focus on the judiciary in South Africa seeks to bridge the divide between the theory and practice. She is a trainer for the Judicial Institute for Africa, focusing on opinion writing and communication skill for judges. She has also served as an acting judge of the North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria for the year 2018, third term as an arbitrator in hearings on racial discrimination in South Africa. She has served on law school committees and the boards of public interest and human rights organizations, including the Africa section of Human Rights Watch, South Africa Partners, and the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. Professor Andrews has received many awards, including in 2015, the National Bar Association's International Award for her global human rights and advocacy. In recognition of her human rights work, the University of KwaZulu-Natal provides an annual award in her name. She started her 2-year term as the president of the Law and Society Association in the year 2019. The topic on which ma'am will be speaking with us today is Examination of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States in the wake of Black Lives Matter movements. Ma'am, it's an honor to have you amongst us. Without having any further ado, I would ask you to please address all of us. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Dixit, for that very kind introduction. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this seminar series. And so I thank you, Mr. Jain and the Dean and everybody for inviting me. As they say in South Africa, all protocol observed. I'm pleased that I'm able to talk about this topic because, as you probably know, the United States is currently at a moment of reckoning as the country tries to grapple with its past of slavery and Jim Crow, Apartheid, and now Black Lives Matter. So what I'm going to do is I have 4 sections to my presentation, and I'll go through the major points, and then hopefully we can have some questions and comments, and I hope, students, that you are preparing some questions and comments for me. So let me start by talking about an article in the New York Times on September 9th, earlier this month, in which the New York Times ran a fairly extensive story that illustrated the lack of diversity and inclusivity in the most influential of American institutions, including the media, business, the Supreme Court, the legislature, and higher education. So, for example, at the United States Supreme Court, 2 judges out of 9 are people of color. People of color make up 40% of the American population. Of the 10 most influential magazines in the United States, and as you know, the United States produces many quite influential magazines, of the 10 of those, the editors of those magazines, there's no person of color. All the editors are white. Of the leaders of the 25 most valued companies in the United States, 6 of the 25, 6 are people of color. And we're not just talking about African Americans here, we're talking about people of color, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and so on. So these statistics, I could go on, they illustrate the lack of diversity and some of the problems that the United States is grappling with. So the story in the New York Times was just another in a string of disclosures that highlighted just how disproportionately resources and influence are spread between white Americans and the rest, and within most Americans, with race and ethnicity being the fault line. Gender is also the fault line because women are also unrepresented or certainly poorly represented, but I'm going to focus just on race and gender. So there was a landmark decision in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which I'm sure you know about, in which the United States Supreme Court for the first time mandated that the country desegregate. And 60 years after Brown, public schools, for example, in the United States are more segregated than they were in 1954. So before we continue, I have a PowerPoint. Dr. Dixit, I wonder if you could just show the PowerPoint. I'll just go through each. They're just about 6 or 7 of them, just to illustrate some of the difficulties and some of the challenges that the United States faces. So if you could go sort of the next one. So this is the wage gap between Black and white Americans, okay? So this is the sort of annual income of Blacks compared to white Americans. You'll see that there's 62%. All right, moving to the next PowerPoint. The per capita income of Black and white Americans. This is just to illustrate some of the differences. And you'll see the gap in income between the orange line is for Blacks and the blue line is for white. You can see that disproportionate income. The next slide, please. Then this is the median income and the poverty rate by race. So you'll see the poverty rate for Blacks is far, far greater than the poverty rate for whites. And then the median income far higher for whites than for Blacks. All right, move to the next slide. This is the number of the Black members of Congress. There are 535 members of Congress. You'll see the small number of Black people who make up the United States Congress. And this is reflected in legislatures across the country, in many of the state legislatures and so on. The next slide. The college attainment of Black and white Americans. So you look at who has completed a college degree in the United States and who has not, and you'll see that Black people certainly perform poorer than white, and less Black people have college degrees. than white people. And the next one, this is home ownership again. You'll see the home ownership rates, 44% black, 73% white. All right, the next slide. Prisoners who are sentenced by race, and this is where we start. This is what is in essence highlighted many of the problems. So blacks make up 12% of the population, and they make up 32% of the prison population. So you'll see the sort of disparate, the rates of imprisonment by race, and by far black people disproportionately are imprisoned. And then I think the second last slide, can we move to the next one? Again, the ratio of imprisonment of black males to white males. You'll see there that black males in the age range 18 to 19 are 12 times more likely to be imprisoned than white males of the same age. And then it goes through, you'll see the slide goes through the different age ranges. And then the next slide, I think that's the last one. Oh, the fatal shootings per million, so the fatal shootings of blacks far outnumber the fatal shootings of other races. So this is also an issue that Black Lives Matter is grappling with. And then the next slide. All right, so that's the where we are, Black Lives Matter. So thank you. I think we're done with the slideshow. I just wanted to illustrate, the slideshow was just to illustrate some of the problems some of the issues that highlight the gap between resources allocated, attainment, home ownership, imprisonment rates, ownership of companies, ownership of influential magazines, a range of ways in which the civil rights struggle of the United States is still incomplete. So, as I said, we find ourselves here at a moment of racial reckoning. And the question, the perennial question now in the wake of Black Lives Matter is what to do, where to go from now, and what space for law and legal institutions. This has been the American question for more than a century. And we have seen many iterations of the civil rights struggle, Dr. Martin Luther King, before then him, the anti-slavery movement, and so on. So what I propose in a paper that I'm working on is, as I said earlier, it might seem utopian in the midst of this contemporary season of great conflict, widespread strife in the country, cynicism, and widespread questioning in the role and the status of traditional institutions, especially of government. As you know, there's a huge battle going on at the moment about the elections, the state of the elections, what will happen to the vote, voter suppression, whether the president will step down when the votes are tallied, postal votes versus in-person votes, and so on. So there's a battle happening in this country. There's also a battle around the pandemic and vaccinations and how we should deal with this issue. So even though we have these challenges and these problems, as I said, my suggestion is that the United States seriously take a breath and consider a mechanism like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, to consider not just past wrongs and the current realities, but also how the country can move towards the promise of the Constitution, and particularly the Bill of Rights, which is about justice and equity. And how can the country move towards reconciliation? The country, at the moment, as I said, we're sitting on the cusp of a national election. and there's no sense about the outcome of the election and the future direction of the country. And so the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission clearly is something that many Americans may be very amenable to, and many may obviously think that it is too unrealistic at this point. So what I'm proposing is that we look at what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa did. What were the possibilities? What were some of the shortcomings, and how the United States could think about such a process? So as I said, the reason for my suggestion comes in the wake of the combination of two things. The first is the pandemic, which has highlighted the disproportionate impact of the virus on Black Americans and to a lesser extent Latino Americans, and a look at the healthcare in the country and other economic resources. And then the other is the protests and the idea that the unfinished business of civil rights need to be addressed, and the energy of young people and the protesters need to be harnessed. So this is the crossroads. And I'm also exploring what the lawyers, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission is part of the lawyers' toolkit. What can we make available, and how can we get to thinking about the possibilities of law to redress injustice? And I'm doing this because I'm one of a group of professors where we teach a course at New York Law School called Race, Bias, and Advocacy. And it's taught by a team of professors in which we examine the ways in which issues of race and racial bias manifest themselves in the law, in the processes of law, and the practice of law, as well as in the structure of the legal profession. In particular, the seminar focuses on the societal forces that shape racial inequality, as well as the impact and possible responses from legal advocates in dealing with racial inequality in their range of legal practices. So although the course aims to raise the substantive issues around law, we also want to think about, we want students, certainly in my seminar, I want students to think about how we creatively explore legal possibilities beyond notions of punitive justice. So in other words, the idea is to think about the ways to explore law in communities where the idea of truth is not just the empirical truth, the scientific truth, but also that they see their experiences, the intergenerational trauma, for example, as generating some kind of truth. Now, we can have discussions about all of this, but in South Africa, they really, at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they looked at various kinds of truth to deal with what people feel the legal system needs to address. So in the paper that I work with the students, I invite them to consider facts beyond empirical facts and to appreciate the experiences of people and consider what's called experiential or dialogic facts. So I begin with a few propositions which I want to share with you. The first proposition is that despite the current discord in the country and the violent contestations about the nature of racism in the United States today, there is some shared agreement and understanding across large sectors of American society about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and its impact on the continued well-being and dignity of Black Americans. So the effect of this legacy, as I said, was shown in the PowerPoint that I just demonstrated, the unequal levels of wealth between African Americans and white, the disproportionate incarceration rates of black males in relation to their counterparts in the population, segregated and inferior public schools, and so on, healthcare, rates of home ownership, and so on. So this is the unfinished business of racial justice. And, you know, we could go on and on about them, and I won't. Maybe in the question and answer session we can look at them. But the other side of that is that there has been racial progress. And there's been significant racial progress in terms of the number of college-educated Black Americans, the number of Black Americans who have entered the professions, law, medicine, and so on. And even though there's small numbers at the state and local level, there've been Black politicians and so on, Blacks in the Congress, small number, but increasing from none. They're now in the Senate and so on. And we all remember that there was a Black president elected in 2008. We also have people like General Colin Powell, the Black leader who became the Secretary of State under George Bush, and so on. So the story is the unfinished business. The second point is that the death of George Floyd and the videotaping of this 8-minute murder on tape, well, alleged murder, we still have a trial to happen, in many ways was such a profound wake-up call for the United States. There was this callousness. I'm sure you all saw the way that the police officer kept his hand in his pocket, his knee on George Floyd's neck, just astounded Americans. But it was something that had been going on and something that Black Americans had been saying for so long, and then there's no longer a denial of it. So there's this shared assumption, I think. The second point I want to raise about all of this is that it is, no matter what happens in November, if the United States wants to remain the United States, a mechanism like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission may be something that they should look at. So I in my paper, I highlight the problems, and I've just given you all the facts and the statistics and so on. The second part of my paper, I'm just going to touch with it very, very briefly, is this idea about Blackness and what it means to be Black in America. And if we think about race, is that the only way that we should consider progress? So there's a big debate in the United States about whether identity, the Black identity, is what we should focus on, as opposed to an economic analysis. That Blackness is to some extent linked to economic inequality and poverty, but not always, and how we deal with this sort of conversions of identity and class and so on. It's a big struggle. And in my paper, I explore the idea that African Americans are like South Africans and Kenyans and Ugandans and other people who have been colonized, that we are the sort of, it's the legacy of colonialism. That slavery is the legacy of colonialism, and the way that Black identity plays out in the United States, that Black Americans have always seen themselves as exceptional. And this idea of America as exceptional has now been blown wide open. There's nothing exceptional about the United States. It has the ravages of poverty, violence, healthcare problems like many countries in the global south, and even the global north. So this idea of exceptionalism I explore with respect to race. Then the third thing that I do is I look at South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think that the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even though it wasn't the first one, there were many, that there were all close to 30 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and so on. But South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for some reason, became the gold standard. And the TRC has been lauded internationally for what it did and what it purported to achieve. Of course, the story is a very mixed one. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa did many good things, but it failed on so many levels. And we look at South Africa today and some of the problems, and it is also the unfinished business there of racism. So in my paper, I look at the TRC, South Africa's TRC, and think about ways that the United States could explore this, mindful of the pitfalls. So the first problem that South Africa's TRC confronted was, who is a victim? How do we articulate and determine who is a victim of centuries of colonialism and 40 years of apartheid? Similarly, in the United States, who is a victim? Descendants of slaves, those immigrants who came to the United States at the end of slavery, who are now Black, recent Black immigrants, etc., etc. How do you cabin victim? That was a difficult question in South Africa, and it's a difficult question in the United States. Then the structure itself. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission had 3 committees to deal with the issues. The first committee was the Human Rights Violations Committee. The second committee was the Reparations Committee. And the third committee was the Amnesty Committee. So the Human Rights Violations Committee is what everybody knew. It was the public display of trauma. It's where you saw the victims come forward, tell their stories, what happened to them and their loved ones, and the perpetrators came forward and explained what they did, how they did it, and some of them asked for forgiveness and so on. The problem in the United States is that the legacy of slavery is contested. The idea that much of the benefit, or a disproportionate amount of the benefit of wealth and the accumulation of wealth in the United States stems from slavery and how property was accumulated. Remember that Black people were property as slaves, and then the intergenerational transfer of wealth. So that is contested. Then the second problem, the first is the question of victims and structure. The second problem is who forgives? Who has the capacity to forgive? Should there be forgiveness? Should it just be truth-telling? South Africa's struggled with this idea. Do you exchange truth for forgiveness, for reconciliation, and so on? I think this is something that the United States will need to grapple with. Do we talk about individual forgiveness or collective forgiveness, and so on? Then the third issue that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with and struggled with is also what the United States is confronting right now, and that is what constitutes reparations. How do you think about reparations and compensation of some kind? Will an apology do? Do you think about public memorials? Removing the statutes, for example, the statues that people are now trying to remove and destroy, and replacing them with statues that are more likely to heal divisions? Do you set up community programs? Do you set up projects? Do you set up programs or continue programs like affirmative action and other kinds of compensatory mechanisms and so on? What kinds of memorials, public memorials, are appropriate? Now, these are very, very difficult questions because, on the one hand, the focus of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as I'm suggesting, suggests that if we look at the legacy of slavery and the experience of Black Americans, but Indigenous Americans, Native Americans, American Indians were the first Americans, and the legacy of dispossession and genocide in those communities we see as well. But if you look at the discussion of American Indians, Native Americans, is really not dealt with much. So this also raises this question. about reparations. And then the third issue that I think will be hard for the United States to deal with is this question of amnesty/forgiveness. I mean, who are the perpetrators? How far do you go back? How do you determine, which institutions and which individuals and so on ought to be named or to be shamed? So these are some of the issues. But what is significant about South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think was important for the United States, is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa served two purposes, two fundamental purposes from my perspective. The first was to memorialize and record experiences as crimes, as these were offences that became part of South Africa's recorded history. And it was very, very important to record. In the United States, Black Americans have long argued that there were never names mentioned, that the atrocities that happened during slavery and Jim Crow, that never ever were people, it was not recorded and so on. So the recording of memory, the official history of the country is very important. And the second is that once the recording happens, there's no longer denial. There's lots of denial that goes on about the past. Many countries struggle with this. But once the recorded official history is there, it's hard for people to deny and go back. And even though people deny things, we know, for example, in a different context, they're Holocaust deniers. It's for the most part, those are fringe sort of fringe groups, and people don't seriously question what happened in Nazi Germany. And then I know I want to leave time for questions, but one issue that I think was very, very significant about South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I think would be helpful that we will also explore in the paper that I'm working on is what we call the institutional Yearnings in South Africa. And what the TRC did was look at individual atrocities caused by individuals, but they also looked at the institutions, the major institutions of the society, and how they contributed to apartheid. So they looked at the media, they looked at the legal profession, they looked at the medical establishment, they looked at the religious establishment, and they looked at the business community to identify the role that these institutions played in reinforcing racism and apartheid. It was very interesting, just as an aside, the legal profession, I made a submission as a lawyer to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the role of law under apartheid. There were many, of course, the whole apartheid legal system was unjust. Apartheid was deemed a crime against humanity. But within the legal system in South Africa, you had an infrastructure of courts and judges and processes that looked like the British. It mimicked the British legal system. But within that structure, there was such injustice. So, for example, the police regularly tortured people to get confessions. And those confessions were accepted by the judges, no matter what. So the judges themselves acquiesced in the torture of people. And then there were judges based on evidence, so solicitors, who sentenced people to death with evidence that were obtained through torture and so on. So that's just one example. The migrant labor system that separated families, the legal system aided and abetted apartheid in ways that it's really quite profound. I think it's a textbook example of how law can institutionalize repression. The white population of South Africa was 12%. How could 12% of the country control 88% of the population? Through law, very often. The processes of law was what kept apartheid in place. So I think this is something that it would be good to look at institutional. What role does the media play? What role do the religious establishments play? We know, for example, in Rwanda, during the genocide, the churches were complicit. We have to look at that. The business community often looks aside in the face of repression and exploitation. I mean, I'm talking about gross exploitation here. So these are some of the questions. And then finally, whether this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it will be of no value if it doesn't have federal government support. That there have been small TRCs in the United States. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in North Carolina that looked at a situation in which there was a riot and many Black people were killed. There was a commission that looked at the confiscation of the property of Black farmers during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There was a commission that looked in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that looked at the wide-scale looting by whites of Black businesses and so on. The Japanese, reparations for the Japanese who were interned during the Second World War in this country, there was a commission. So there have been these small commissions. What I am saying is that this requires a wholesale country buy-in, because it will mean nothing. The country at the moment is very divided. There are red states and blue states, and people aren't sharing these ideas. And in order for some kind of reconciliation to occur, it has to have the imprimatur of the government. So I think, as I said, this may seem utopian, but as Frederick Douglass, the anti-slavery advocate, said, many ideas sort of, they fester for a while, they seem wholly unlikely, and then at some point they become inevitable. So I'm hoping that this idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States at some point, no matter where we go in November, becomes something that's at least possible, if not inevitable. So I'll stop there and ask for questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think the topic which you have chosen today is much of relevance in today's time, and I find it really ironical that in the time where so much can be discussed and so much can be debated upon, we still have to discuss the point that we are still facing racism at this journey in the year 2020. Ma'am, moving ahead, we have received few questions. One by one, I'll address them to you. The first question being, to what extent labeling theory, as proposed by William Campbell as proposed in the year 1973, is valid in today's time? If it's still valid, to what extent Black kids labeled as roughneck, white kids as saints, is affecting reformative approach in criminal justice system?
Yes, so the question, I understand it, is that whites are sort of seen as good and Blacks are bad. The stereotype. This is a major problem in the United States. And the racial profiling of Black youth, particularly in the large cities like New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and so on, is a serious problem. So you have these terms, driving while Black, golfing while Black, being in Central Park while Black, and so on. You know about the incident in Central Park where a Black male was watching birds and so on. So the profiling is very much a part of the problem, because they do the stereotype, and there's now a lot of literature around implicit bias, that the way that white Americans, and particularly white police officers and so on, approach Black people is through a biased lens. And that creates huge problems in the United States. But you know, this idea of Blackness and this sort of idea that the police look upon Black youth as more suspicious and less trustworthy and so on, is a phenomenon that's part of the United States. The United Kingdom, if you look at some of the reports in the United Kingdom, for example, and what happens to young people in London and Liverpool and so on, it's the same sort of problem. So this bias against Blackness is a serious problem, and I think it requires education. I think it requires a certain kind of cultural sensitivity. It is the most difficult problem. So the student who asked that question, That's a really good question that goes to the heart of the problem, because it's not just the police, it's when you're the judges. There's now research that shows that prosecutors approach the prosecution of particularly black males with bias. That judges, in the United States, you probably have heard of the Innocence Project that started about 25 years ago. The Innocence Project has managed to get the courts to exonerate a significant number of particularly black males, but there have also been some white males who have been imprisoned, and some on death row. And it's been clear that the evidence was tainted, that the process was tainted. That is profound, that somebody can get out to death row. And a part of the problem is bias that generates and animates much of the activity. So yes, it's a problem. I don't know if there's a lot of work being done around bias. There are implicit bias workshops, there's training, a range of things. But it's a very difficult one.
Certainly, ma'am. This question was actually raised by one of our faculty members, Mr. Omkareshwar Pathak. Now, moving on to the next question. It's again raised by one of our faculty members, Dr. Anita Ladda. Blacks faced unfair treatment in dealing with police or in the courts, and blacks were perceived racial biases to be greater in the criminal justice system than in the other institution. Is there any specific grounds for the same?
There's specific grounds for the same. Can you just clarify the question?
I'll repeat the question one more time, ma'am. Blacks faced unfair treatment dealing with police or in the courts, and blacks perceived racial biases to be greater in the criminal justice system than in the other institutions. Is there any specific grounds for the same?
I think that the question that you raised is the perceptions about racial bias in the criminal justice system, is it worse than in other institutions? Right, so that's also a great question. I mean, I'd love to engage with your faculty some more. You ask good question, terrific question. So, that's a hard one. I don't think that it's greater in the criminal justice system. The consequences, I think, are because they involve people's liberty and sometimes lives, obviously. But also the bias in the business sector, for example, the promotion of black people, the appointment of black people, the way that people are compensated. There's now research that shows all of that. So I think it's a problem across the United States. It's across the United States in government, in media, so yes, the criminal justice system, because it is so stark. I mean, you don't see, the business of racial bias in business, in corporations and so on, is hidden. It's behind closed doors. You may see it in the ledgers and in the business documents. But the police bias, you see when a police officer has got his neck on his knee on the neck of a black person on the street with impunity. So I think that's the difference. But I would say, I haven't seen the research, and that's why I say it's such an excellent question. I've not seen the research, but the New York Times article, and you can get it on the New York Times website. It's the article that says 80% or 80% are white, yet it's about the influence of the lack of influence of black Americans in the powerful institutions in the country. So I think that it's there, it's widespread. And whether it's less or not is a good question. I can't say, but I would say that it is all over the show. And I mean, one of the saddest things about this country, from my perspective, is the division in the religious establishments, and particularly the Christian establishment. There's actually a white church and a black church, the white Baptist church and the black Baptist church in the United States. I mean, Christianity, love all your mankind, love your brother and sister. All of that you'll see there as well, the impact of bias. Sometimes it's not even bias. Sometimes it's just outright racism. But that's all part of it. I think it's really good to actually investigate that. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, ma'am. Moving on to the next question. The question which is being asked is, what is the role of the government in removing the socio-economic disparity on the basis of color, basically in US?
What is the role of the government? So here's the thing, that the United States, like India, is a federal system. And states' rights are very, very important in the United States. I mean, that was what the Civil War in this country was about the right of states to keep slavery. And this idea of states' rights lives to this day. And much of the benefits of it, much of the ways of addressing discrimination or the health and well-being of citizens happens at the state level. So depending on which state you live in, you'll see that government either has a strong role or not. So New York and California are two states, democratic states, in which this, what we call the social welfare net, is quite strong. So that the government is committed to programs of social security, unemployment, etc. But national government also has a role. National government has a role with respect to the social security payments which people get after the age of 62, unemployment to some extent, bolstering state unemployment. The affirmative action program that you know about in India, it's the same in the United States. Very often national government have processes in place. And the affirmative action programs can either be that federal government contracts will only go to companies, or 10% or 20% of federal government contracts will go to Black-owned companies, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these ways. So government has a role, but the federal government has a lower role, a limited role. The state governments have a stronger role. So if you live in a state where the state doesn't actually believe in many of these programs, then you just don't have them. I mean, some states, like the state of Nevada, where Las Vegas is the capital, doesn't have income tax. So people like to go and live in Nevada, but if you don't have income tax, there are a whole bunch of things that the government can't provide because they don't have a tax base like New York, which is a high tax base, but government does provide. So I think that government does have a role, and I think government should have a strong role, but that's my philosophical position. There are people who believe that government should have no role in much of this, or very limited role, and that the market should take care, and private institutions should take care of, the well-being of citizens.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question, which is being posted by another faculty member, Dr. Yash Tiwari. What are the strategies to manage the viral outbreaks of racism?
To manage the violent outbreaks of racism. The strategies. You've probably seen these pictures of these militias in Portland and in Louisville and in Seattle and so on. The different strategies. So in what has now transpired and what has been revealed is that within the police departments in many cities and states, that there are right-wing sympathizers and neo-Nazi groups within the departments. So these right-wing groups that the FBI have designated as huge challenges to American security, it's hard to fight them as vigorously as they should, because there's this problem that's been illuminated, that the police are sympathetic to these groups. These are heavily armed groups, and one of the things that people forget, the first major terrorist attack in modern America post-Second World War happened in Oklahoma City, where a white right-wing terrorist blew up a federal building, and about something like 200 people died. People often think about terrorism as something out there, and we did have 9/11 and so on, but these groups are a threat to the United States. They really are. They are dangerous. They're armed. They're heavily armed. The problem is there's a lack of will in certain to deal with them. And so the strategy would be, I think a good strategy would be a completely unconditional commitment of the United States government and state governments to confront and disarm these groups, because they're terrorist groups. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that gun ownership in the United States is a constitutional right. The Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, is sacred to the Americans. I grew up in South Africa, so I don't understand this. But when I lived in Indiana in the Midwest for 3 years, and I really got to understand why Americans love their guns. But the problem is that gun ownership has been so many, the number of people who are shot, not just the mass killings that you hear about all the time. And the tragedy is we don't even hear about some mass killings because some of it is so common now. They're no longer newsworthy. So gun ownership, I think, is the second problem. But as I said, it's a constitutional right. You don't get rid of that. And then the third is just education, that people, Switzerland has also the same gun laws as the United States. The Swiss people apparently also own guns to the same degree as the United States, but Swiss people are not running around shooting each other, going into churches, going into synagogues, going into mosques, going into nightclubs, going into private schools, elementary schools, and so on, to shoot up people. So I think that's the third is the cultural, educational part. And these are very, very difficult to confront.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another question which is being asked by our faculty member, Dr. Kartaini Singh, is that is there any political party in the US under whose tenure the instances of racism or discrimination on part of states is observed to be more?
The observance of anti-discrimination is more. That's the question. I would say that there are states, I mentioned New York and California. I think New York and California, and most of the states that I think are run by Democratic governors and state legislatures tend to be more liberal in their approach to anti-discrimination and more committed to anti-discrimination. So officially, those places are more committed to anti-discrimination. Whether those places are less racist is a different question, but they're certainly more diverse. I mean, if you're sitting on a subway in New York City, you have everybody from the world right there. The whole human gene pool is represented on a New York City subway. And if you go through Queens and Brooklyn, not even Manhattan, you see it. So it's diverse. You could go to parts of the country where you don't see a black face, you don't see a brown face. It's much, much more racially, particularly the sort of rural parts of the country. So I would say that now the democratic states appear to be more committed in their laws, their policies, and so on, and the demographics. California is a state where whites are not in the majority. And increasingly in New York, I think that will be the case. Who owns the wealth is a different story, but they are more committed. I just want to go back to the earlier question about violence. I spoke about white right-wing violence, and which is a problem. But there's also been violence that some of the protesters have perpetrated. The looting of stores and the attacking of people has also happened from the protest side. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed as well. That when there are problems and when people are angry, I can understand that, for example, yesterday in Louisville, Kentucky, the Attorney General decided that they would not prosecute any of the police officers who shot Breonna Taylor, this young woman who was killed in her bed. So the impetus is to go and burn down the place. Well, as protesters, from my perspective, that serves no purpose, because the places that are burned are in the neighborhoods where people live. They don't serve any justification. And so that kind of violence it may be understandable, but it's counterproductive and completely, from my perspective, not helpful to the community. So that's another kind of violence that's just addressed to the earlier question.
Right, ma'am. Few of the questions which have been raised by our students are, one of the students has asked, number of slides shows that wide difference between black and white. Is Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States and other similar institutions play a vital role to solve this problem of racism? If yes, then for how long the black males will have to face this problem?
Oh, for how long? You know, it's sort of this is the American condition. Slavery ended, nearly say 150 years ago, and we still see the legacies of slavery. The first official court judgment to state that segregation is wrong and unlawful happened 60 years ago, and they're still struggling. These problems don't solve themselves in a decade, in a generation. I think that, and particularly if there's a lack of commitment. So this is not something that I think in our lifetimes we see. Look at South Africa. South Africa had a wonderful transition from apartheid to democracy, and it's been a very messy democracy. And there's a lot of racism in the country. It's, the xenophobia, for example, against other Africans, Afrophobia, as people have called it. And apartheid was about racism. So it's cyclical. It takes a long time. But I think in the short term, the Black Lives Matter movement have actually made some inroads. So the US Congress, as well as state legislatures, have actually changed some of the practices of police. So, for example, in New York, one of the things that they've done is that they banned the chokehold. The chokehold is a common method of police when they try and restrain somebody. So that's the one thing, and chokeholds have led to deaths. The second is that in New York, they have now opened the records of the police, of police officers who had complaints filed against them. So you can go and look at, if there's a police officer who's been charged with abuse, you can look at the record of that police officer and see how many complaints there've been against that officer. In some states now, they've banned the no-knock warrant. And the no-knock warrant, you see it in movies, where these cops go and then they bash down the door and so on, but they don't often identify themselves. And in Louisville, what happened was that Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend thought that this was a home invasion. They didn't realize that these were police officers because they were in plain clothes. And it's questionable whether they identified themselves, and Breonna Taylor's boyfriend shot at the police, and that's why they shot back and killed her. So no-knock warrants are now outlawed. So there's a range of things that the governments have done. So Black Lives Matter have in the short term had some victories, and that may have an impact for certain black males in the short term. And then there will be consequences in the medium and long term. One of the things that the United States Congress has done is they've passed legislation to provide for a national registry of abusive police officers. So what is the practice is a police officer will be dismissed from a police force, say in Georgia, and because of abuse. And then he'll move to Nebraska, and there'll be no record, and the same police officer will then perpetrate the same problem. So the National Register will provide a list of police officers who have been dismissed for abuse so that they can't move around the country. And then it's like what the Catholic Church did with priests. I hope none of you are Catholic. I'm a Catholic, so I can say this. The Catholic Church moved these abusive priests from parish to parish and allowed them to abuse children. Well, this is the same with police officers. They go from, jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another question which is being posted here is that as far as the US criminal justice system is concerned, how far has it come from the Central Park 5 case where 5 Black and Hispanic teenagers were tortured to get a confession to an assault and rape they didn't commit and were convicted and imprisoned?
You're talking about the Central Park 5? What is the question about them?
How far has it come? Like these teenagers were tortured to get a confession to an assault and rape, which they didn't commit, and were convicted and imprisoned.
Yes, yes. So what has happened is, I don't know if you've seen it. You should. It's an interesting documentary that was made about this. They called the Central Park Five because they were arrested in Central Park, and the documentary has been very, very good because it's highlighted. And that, since the five were released from prison, of course they got huge payouts from the city of New York. Since the documentary has been released and the report has come out, it shows how at every step of the investigation, as well as the prosecution, you saw the mistakes. And it's a textbook case of racial bias. So these young boys, they were arrested, and they were all boys, they were young. They were, firstly, the way that the confessions were elicited from them showed that the police officers thought they were guilty from the start. They were not going to look at alternatives. Then with the prosecution, and what was very, very sad about this case was that even the young men, they were boys, as I said, the young men, their families, some of their families doubted them. They constructed and built such a case against them that people who should have been their allies were turned against them. So what has happened is that, again, this has been looked at by the Attorney General in the state of New York, as well as prosecutors and law enforcement, to ensure that what happened to them doesn't occur again. So there have been reforms. So individually they've been compensated, and there have been changes that have resulted in, their prosecution. What's been very interesting is, I don't know if you know about the incident a few months ago where a black birder, he's a very enthusiastic bird watcher in Central Park. And in Central Park, there are all these beautiful birds. So he was in an enclosure looking at birds, and there was a woman with a dog, and her dog was not on a leash. So he asked her to put her dog on a leash because the dog scares the birds and chases away the birds, and he was watching birds. And she decided, she says it, he films her saying, "I'm going to call the police, and I'm going to tell the police that there's a black man who's threatening me." And it blew up in her face because the moment has shifted. People were actually outraged. And of course, what happened to her, I think that it's terrible. They just piled it on. She lost her job. She was vilified on social media. It was just terrible. There's overkill on the part of people who thought that she acted inappropriately, which she clearly did. But it demonstrated two things. The first is that she felt comfortable. She knew that racism in the police department could work to her advantage. She was breaking the rules, and he was doing what, he was entitled to do, and she was going to use racial bias and profile to get him in trouble. But the second thing is that the tide has turned, that there's such acute awareness now of these kinds of things that she totally misjudged the moment. And so I think, you sort of juxtapose Park 5 and what happened with the birder in Central Park, and you'll see that we're at different moments right now.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Another question which is being posted here is that with the influx of immigrants and changing demographics, do you see the possibilities of equal treatment to all, especially when it becomes a political compulsion to focus during the elections, or it shall only have a short-term impact around the elections?
No, I think the influx of immigrants, the thing is that the influx of immigrants is what has made the United States on some levels, a highly successful country. The energy of the United States has been provided by immigrants. It's that immigrants, since its founding, the people who came on the Mayflower from England were immigrants. The only people who were here were the indigenous Americans. Everybody else was an immigrant. And some, of course, were forcibly brought here as slaves. I think that immigrants have always been the lifeblood and the health and the vitality of the United States. But immigrants, of course, immigrants differ in many, many ways. I feel very, very uncomfortable when I talk about African Americans and Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and so on, because these are not monolithic groups. Asian Americans consist of people from India, Pakistan, China, Tibet, from Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. People have different ideas about a range of things. So when you put people in blocks, I think it's a problem. But I think that with the diversity that people bring and the different perspectives is very, very healthy. And I think it will also change, or at least contribute to some different way of looking at the history of racism and the history of slavery and so on. So it's not just short term. I think that the statistics show that by the year 2040, the United States will be a majority black-brown country. In fact, it will be a brown country because whites will become increasingly a minority. And I think that's causing a lot of the anxiety amongst people who support Trump, white people who support Trump, the anxiety of what demographically the United States is becoming. And I think that the whole immigration story is the story that's ultimately going to figure in the reconciliation and how the United States sees the country. So yeah, I think that it's not just short term, it's long term, it's happened, it's part of the history of this country, it's the backbone, it's the fabric of the United States, and will continue to be so. Now the problem is that President Trump is determined to stem immigration, and particularly immigration from countries that are not European. But when the immigrants came from Norway and Germany and Sweden and so on, there was quite a comfort with it. Immigrants increasingly come from countries from Africa, from Asia, South America, and so on. So I think that's part of the problem. And now the attempts to really stem the influx of immigrants, and I think that's to the disadvantage of the United States. It cannot be this creative and energetic country without the influx of immigrants. And I would say that when I turn on the television and I look at doctors who come on and talk about the pandemic, you will be pleased to know that the huge proportion of the doctors who come and talk to the American public about those who live in the United States are people originally from India, whether they actually came to the United States or whether their parents came and so on. But, in the medical profession, there's a range of ways in which in technology we see that, in San Francisco, in the technology world and so on, you see huge numbers of immigrants. And many are people who would identify as Indian. So I think that when you think about the energy and the creativity of the United States, it's immigrants have provided much of it. I mean, if you look at for example, the United States still historically has produced the largest numbers of Nobel Prize winners in physics and medicine and so on. And when you look at the names of people, it's not Jones and Mayer. It's names of people who they're not Anglo names. They're names that we associate with immigrants.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Few more questions lined up for you. One of them is, to what extent would you attribute racism in modern society to racial mythologies?
To racial?
Mythologies.
Mythologies. To racial mythologies. Oh yeah. There's the stereotypes, in other words. It's stereotypes loom large in racism. What's very interesting, I think, in the discussion about racial mythologies and stereotypes, sometimes the stereotypes are sort of seen as flattering, as complimentary. So in the United States, they have this term model minorities. And particularly Asian Americans are seen as model minorities. And what does it mean? People who come, work hard, excel in school, are good citizens and so on, compared to those who come and may be seen as a stereotype. They join gangs, they, Mexicans are this and so on, Africans are that. So it is a problem, Now the thing is that you can never get rid of stereotypes because communities themselves, I mean, if you're within a group of Jewish people, African people, even African American people within themselves have stereotypes. We all have stereotypes about the groups we belong, whether we're women, whether a group of lawyers, and so on. And the question is, how do those stereotypes impact on the rights and dignity of the individuals and the communities that we're talking about? And I think that's very, very difficult. Law works hard to counter stereotypes, but stereotypes is so much part of the human condition. And I'm all for a stereotype if it benefits somebody, but if it disadvantages and goes against the dignity of somebody, then I think we should work against it.
Absolutely right, ma'am. Another question which is here is, what was the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding racism? Any concrete steps taken by them in the form of direction or anything else?
In South Africa? Yes, I take it. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was interesting because if you think about nearly 400 years of colonialism and 40 years of apartheid, when they designated victims, there were 22,000 victims. And these victims were people who had suffered abuse, where the perpetrators had committed crimes against humanity and war crimes. There were essentially millions of South Africans who were victims. A system like that unleashes many millions. But these were people who just suffered the ordinary death. So the 22,000 victims, there was compensation promised. And it was a sum of money that it wasn't particularly, it wasn't a large sum of money. But it was, it made a difference. Could have made a difference in the short term to people's lives. And so people did most received compensation. But as I said, it was not sufficient. And then the second was that they set up memorials in various places, statues and so on, memorial parks. The Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. If you've never been to Johannesburg and you go there, go to the Apartheid Museum. It's a very well-constructed institution. But I think that the business of reconciliation was a casualty because South Africans are not reconciled. If you look at some of the violence, if you look at the xenophobia, if you look at the economic inequality. I mean, most people, if they have decent lives, a house, kids can go to school, they're not treated with impunity by the police, most people would find that they can live decent, dignified lives. That's not the case in South Africa for a range of reasons, the economic inequality. So there was some good. As I said earlier, the record shows what happened, but it's incomplete. So does paying individuals make a difference? It probably makes a difference to the individual in the short term, in the medium term. But in South Africa, I would say it's incomplete. Good things, if you weigh up the good and the bad. The most important thing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was South Africa needed a bridge from apartheid to democracy. They had to go from one place to the next. And that is why I think the United States has to go from this place of great conflicts, of racial polarization and political polarization to another place where the country can again at least begin to see their fellow citizens as worthy of dignity and respect. And that's not happening.
Certainly, ma'am. One of the few last questions which we have is the white powers of police in USA is intentionally provided, and therefore the usage of word due process of law is there. Is it high time to codify various procedures in an elaborate manner related to police arrest or the dealings with the public at large, contrary to rely on judicial time in order to counter labelist per se?
In order to come to?
Counter labelist per se.
To counter?
Labelist.
Labelist. Labelist. The question, as I understand it, is that are there sufficient mechanisms in law to deal with some of these racist tendencies? Is that the question? Am I understanding it correctly? You know, I teach constitutional law, and American constitutional law is filled with all kinds of constitutional rights, procedural rights, due process rights, equal protection. It's all there in the law. It's in the Constitution. It's in the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. The question is the implementation. And so how do you marry? The rights are there. The whole infrastructure of the United States, the legal infrastructure for the most part, is in place. It's the implementation and it's the cultural and the attitudinal problems around stereotypes, etc., that is the problem. And so what you really need is enforcement. You need enforcement of the rights that are incorporated in the Constitution. If you look at the due process rights, if you look at equal protection under the 14th Amendment, if you look at the 8th Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, these are mechanisms in the law. But as in most places, you can have almost the perfect constitution and constitutional rights. But if the people are not there to implement and enforce them, then you do have a problem. So to the law students, I say, the jobs of lawyers is to ensure that the laws on the books and so on are enforced and implemented.
On that note, I think this has been one of the most debatable and most discussing interactions we have ever had. Thank you so much, ma'am, for providing us with your time. And on this note, I would really like to thank you and extend my deepest regards. And thanks to you for providing and sharing your pearls of wisdom from your rich acumen. And thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation despite the huge time difference. This clearly shows your passion and dedication towards this profession. Thank you so much, ma'am. And I'd also like to thank us.
And I applaud your faculty and students. You asked terrific questions. This has been very stimulating. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right.